You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Visit USAA.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
When, in his first term of office, Donald Trump began to impose sweeping tariffs, threatening to spark a trade war, it was big news, though it shouldn't have been a big surprise. His America First policy is not only a neo-Nazi dog whistle, though because of its historical connection to American Nazi sympathizers, it certainly is that. And before Nazi sympathizers and even outright Nazi foreign agents used the slogan, it was used by the Ku Klux Klan. And before even that, it was in use by the Know Nothing Party, a virulently anti-immigrant party that I've had many occasions to talk about in the podcast. But America First has also come to represent an approach to foreign policy emphasizing American nationalism and non-interventionism. Part and parcel of foreign policy is foreign trade, and in this regard, America First means protectionism, the restriction of imports for the purposes of bolstering domestic industries. So it should not have been surprising when Trump imposed tariffs on certain products, like washing machines and solar panels. But it was more concerning when he put tariffs on all steel and aluminum, affecting trade with many nations. And his punishing tariffs on China were especially worrisome, as the retaliatory tariffs certainly did indicate a trade war. At the time, there were questions, as there have been about much that Trump does, about how legal it was for Trump to impose these tariffs. Trump cited the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act as providing him the authority to impose these tariffs, but this law does not explicitly mention tariffs. Additionally, it requires the declaration of a national emergency, but that has not stopped Trump, who routinely invokes national emergency powers in such a way that has been described by the Brennan Center for Justice and others as an abuse of power. There have been only 90 declarations of national emergency in American history since the first was declared by Woodrow Wilson, and Trump has declared 19 of them and counting, more than 20%, and far more than any other president. He characterizes what he views as unfairness in foreign trade as grounds for seizing emergency powers to regulate commerce meant only for wartime. And sometimes he has invoked the IEEP without even declaring an emergency. This is right out of every authoritarian's playbook, such as when Hitler exploited the Reichstag fire to seize emergency powers. There are other legal justifications for his tariff powers, but those have checks and balances. The Trade Act of 1974 does empower the president to impose limited tariffs, up to only 15%, but only for 150 days, without the approval of Congress for an extension. Trump has cited the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 as justification for his steel and aluminum tariffs, though it had never been used before and was limited to the imposition of tariffs on a specific article that is being imported in such large quantities that it threatens national security, which Trump claimed in relation to steel and aluminum without any clear justification. Even these first tariffs had a disastrous effect on the U.S. economy. Before Trump agreed to the lifting of these tariffs in key countries, his tariffs caused a dramatic reorganization in the global supply chain, reduced American incomes, and contrary to what Trump likes to claim about tariffs bolstering U.S. manufacturing, they reduced employment in the manufacturing sector. Since inevitably the increased cost of imported goods gets passed on to consumers rather than be eaten by manufacturers, the price of intermediate goods went up, and this disruption of the supply chain and cost of goods, when combined with the ensuing economic crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, is largely responsible for recent inflation. But even though it can be credibly argued that Trump caused the inflation he railed against in his recent re-election campaign, he was swept back into office, largely based on his promises to reverse that inflation. However, rather than do things differently this time around, he has simply declared more emergencies and declared even more sweeping tariffs. Recently, on a day that he melodramatically called Liberation Day, he declared unprecedented universal tariffs on everything from every country. Economists everywhere were aghast, as were traders who saw the stock market crash, and everyday Americans whose 401ks lost much of their value. Major financial institutions like S&P Global, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan all began sounding the alarm that this crisis would mean a looming U.S. recession. But Trump doubled down, claiming that although there may be struggles at first, in the long run this would renew the American manufacturing sector. Even though experts warned that because of the globalization of markets, this was outmoded thinking. Even if American companies were forced to invest in domestic manufacturing, they would still take a huge hit financially. The building of factories and spinning up of production would take years. The goods they produce would likely still be more expensive than foreign-produced goods, and the tariffs would need to be permanent for these industries to even stay afloat. For as soon as they were lifted, their entire business model would suddenly no longer be feasible. So rather than spur companies to bring their manufacturing to America, tariffs instead encourage them to do nothing and wait it out. In the meantime, the trade wars on all fronts that Trump has declared are threatening an economic collapse. Finally, the day before I started writing this episode, upon seeing that the U.S. bonds market showed signs that it may crash, Trump blinked and put a 90-day pause on most of his exorbitant tariffs, though he left the 10% universal tariffs in place. His representatives have portrayed this as just an example of his brilliant negotiation, that he scared everyone with a showing of strength and now is giving everyone a chance to come to the negotiation table, even though that is not what he had always claimed. His whole reasoning behind these maneuvers was that it would bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and fund tax cuts. But in order to not lose face after finally unmistakably seeing how wrong he was and how terribly his actions have affected the economy, he's now pretending that he was just bluffing all along. This must produce a moment of clarity for everyone, Trump supporters and critics alike. A simple survey of the history of tariffs in America can easily demonstrate that Trump is not always what he seems. He is not always plotting some devious and clever fascist undermining of democracy. Sometimes he is just incompetent and stupid. This is historical blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I'm sure you may be sick of hearing about taxes imposed on imported goods, but the topic is useful for demonstrating not only that Trump refuses to acknowledge experts and established fact, but also that he seems incapable of learning from the lessons of the past. Thank you for listening to Tariff Men, a history of the U.S. in tariff controversies. Before we begin, I want to thank all of my patrons on Patreon. Additional huge thanks to Stuart Hall for your recent donation on PayPal and vocal support of my recent content. It's much appreciated. Also, not sure if I ever thanked James Gilliland for a donation on PayPal back in January, so thank you as well. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long. and they tie in with the main episode topics, and they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on Pope Joan, I released a minisode about the so-called pornocracy, which, as was the case with Aspasia, seems to be just another case of women gaining political power and men calling them harlots because of it. And after my episode on Easter myths, I released an episode further differentiating the goddess Atargatis from the goddess Ishtar and clarifying an argument I'd raised in a previous episode about eunuch priests in her cult and the cult of Cybele as being examples of transgender persons in history. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. Surprisingly, as dry and boring as the topic of tariffs may seem, it is deeply enmeshed in major episodes of American history. Thus, a history of tariffs in the U.S. is a history of the U.S. Starting at the beginning, tariffs played a large part in the lead-up to the American Revolution. In some ways, the American Revolution was a rebellion against taxes and tariffs. Great Britain was going broke fighting the 7 Years' War and sought to refill its coffers by taxing colonies, principally by imposing taxes on imports, which we should all recognize as tariffs. First was the 1765 Stamp Act, and next the Townshend Acts of 1767, which included a duty on tea. Then came the Tea Act of 1773, which was intended to give the British East India Company a trade advantage in importing tea. And most Americans know a thing or two about the rejection of this law and the ensuing act of civil disobedience, the Boston Tea Party, the effects of which further contributed to the Revolution. What many don't know is that American colonists wanted to impose their own tariffs at the time. Protectionism was a popular approach to international trade back then, and with some fledgling industries in the colonies, which Alexander Hamilton called quote-unquote infant industries, it was believed by many, including Hamilton, that without some protection and the imposition of tariffs on foreign goods, these industries would never be able to compete, and America would forever be a vassal state, producing only raw materials and agricultural products. Of course, Britain was against the industrialization of her colonies for this very reason, because it meant more independence, and so the colonies were forbidden from imposing tariffs. This is why, following America's War of Independence and the ratification of the Constitution, the second bill signed by George Washington was the Tariff Act of 1789. It served more than one purpose. Not only was it intended to support domestic manufacturing, but it was also intended to fund the federal government. Eventually, the country would move away from import tariffs as a method of funding the government, for good reason, and would move to the model of income tax. And here, we already begin to see the backwards thinking of Trump, a billionaire who, like most members of his class, have an aversion to taxation. Trump thinks reversion to a tariff model of revenue building means we could eventually do without income tax. He has actually said as much. So when he says he wants to make America great again, he means, at least in part, that he wants to revert its model of government funding to a pre-industrial model from the 18th century. But as we will see, the further history of tariffs, especially when imposed during more modern economic conditions, lead me to believe he didn't look much into them at all. It's almost like he said, "What can we do for money instead of income tax?" And someone said, "Well, they used to use tariffs." what a brilliant economic mind. Despite the intention of encouraging the sale of products manufactured domestically, U.S. tariffs never rose high enough to accomplish that. So instead, it just remained the principal way that the government was funded. This didn't change until the War of 1812, when tariffs were doubled in order to account for war spending. With tariffs of around 25%, domestic industries did see substantial benefits and began to push for even higher tariffs. Protectionism was the watchword under the Whig political party, whose economic plan was called the American System, consisting of support for a national bank and high tariffs. These tariffs peaked in 1828, with legislation setting a 38% tariff on certain imports and tariffs as high as 45% on some raw materials. Already within only about 15 years of higher tariffs, the cracks in this plan began to show. This tariff act raised taxes on British goods with a view toward bolstering northern economies, which were manufacturing-based. But southern states complained that it hurt their economies. They had to pay more for imported goods, which of course is always the result of tariffs, since the cost is passed on to domestic importers. And they argued that if they were to buy less from the British, it meant the British would buy less of their cotton. So already it becomes clear that tariffs have unforeseen and less controllable results in more complex economic systems. And we also see how they can contribute to factionalism. Here we see early rumblings of the American Civil War. The South called this the Tariff of Abominations, and the notion that under an Andrew Jackson presidency this tariff would be reduced was one of the big draws that led to his election in 1829. However, nothing changed under Jackson, and one southern state, South Carolina, began to advocate the political notion that a state could simply declare any federal law they disliked null and void. This legal theory and movement would lead to the nullification crisis, a classic example of constitutional crisis that led to further schism between the North and South when Jackson's vice president, South Carolina's own John Calhoun, resigned in order to fight for the constitutionality of nullification in the Senate. 2 compromise tariffs had to be passed, reducing the Tariff of Abominations, as well as an act authorizing military force to be used on South Carolina before this crisis would pass. Now we find ourselves in another era of extreme sectionalism, when political rhetoric frequently turns to the idea of secession and a new civil war, and when many states would find the notion of nullification appealing. It is troubling, to say the least, that Trump seems intent on imposing some of the same conditions that previously contributed to the Civil War during this palpable climate of division. But judging from the outcry on both sides of the aisle, and from his own corporate donors, and from the everyday people in his constituency who have lost real wealth because of these tariffs, perhaps this blunder will unite rather than further divide the country. I have a little theory on why Trump loves tariffs so much. And love them he does, calling them, quote, a beautiful thing to behold, end quote, and even calling the word itself, quote, the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary, end quote. I suspect that he fancies himself a modern Abraham Lincoln in this regard. Trump's fixation on Lincoln has been noted before. He frequently compares himself to the 16th president. Perhaps this is because late in 2019, a few years into his disastrous first term, but just before the cataclysms of 2020, prominent never-Trumpers, the moderate Republicans most vocally opposed to him, founded the Lincoln Project Political Action Committee, directly contrasting Trump with Lincoln, whom they and many Republicans view as the founder of their party, even though it would be unrecognizable to Lincoln today. Or maybe it's because Lincoln is consistently ranked America's greatest president, while he is ranked worst. More recently, it may be because of the attempt on his life. I would suggest that it's because both have presided over the most divided Americas and were themselves viewed as extremely divisive figures, but I don't think Trump views it that way. He has actually, on numerous occasions, criticized Lincoln, suggesting that if he were president, he would have struck a deal and the Civil War would never have happened, which is rich, considering how frequently his enablers like to raise the specter of a new civil war. One might imagine the arrangement he, with his art of the deal, would have struck, likely leaving the institution of slavery in place, since historians have suggested that this was the only quote-unquote deal that might have defused the war. The reason I think Lincoln inspired him to take such an interest in tariffs is because he has actually quoted Lincoln on the topic, something which many have failed to notice. In 2018, he posted the statement, quote, "I am a tariff man," end quote, on social media, with the words tariff and man capitalized, and he was roundly mocked with memes of him as a superhero with the most boring theme imaginable. Interestingly, Lincoln also called himself a tariff man in 1860, and so did newspapers, with one Pennsylvania paper saying he was, quote, "a consistent and earnest tariff man from the first hour of his entering public," end quote. Indeed, Lincoln's support of tariffs, which the South still opposed, further contributed to the secession of Southern states. 2 days before Lincoln took office, a new tariff passed, the Morrill Tariff, that was, as before, seen as favoring the northern industrial economy over the South's slave-based agricultural economy. And with a self-avowed tariff man coming into office, there was little hope of it being repealed. So tariffs were a further excuse for Southern rebellion, even though, of course, the preservation of slavery was the real reason. So it's pretty funny that Trump thinks he could have stopped the Civil War, but also describes himself as a tariff man. It's also funny that he is promoting an absolutely outmoded economic theory. Even Lincoln, a huge fan of tariffs in the 1860s, said of them, quote, "It still becomes necessary to modify and change its operations according to new interests and new circumstances," end quote. Yet today, we see Trump wielding them like it's still the 19th century. Now for a brief intermission. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint Mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
New Vitamin Water Zero Sugar Pineapple Passion Fruit is packed with vitamins, just like the amount of peas we packed in that sentence. It's packed like your tote bag, the one you stole from your ex, or your overpriced half a studio apartment, or extra rushed rush hour traffic. Packed like your calendar. Triple booked at 5, of course. Grab a vitamin water. Did we mention it's packed with vitamins?
Now, back to the show. Now, I may be wrong in suggesting he models himself on Lincoln in declaring himself a quote-unquote tariff man. In his second term, Trump has focused less on Lincoln and more on President William McKinley, another victim of presidential assassination and another tariff man. McKinley called himself, quote, a tariff man standing on a tariff platform, end quote. And Trump has claimed that under McKinley, when, quote, we were a tariff-backed nation, end quote, the country was, quote, proportionately the wealthiest it has ever been, end quote. What he fails to recognize is that the second half of the 19th century was a time of huge industrial growth driven by technology, like electricity and railroads, and access to cheap labor made possible by increased immigration, which Trump would certainly not have approved of. McKinley also didn't think of tariffs the way Trump does. He knew that they weren't something that others paid, but that they were, by their very nature, taxes that Americans would end up paying. And despite a high tariff rate at the end of the 19th century, they weren't used as the principal funding of the government by that time, as they had been before the Civil War. The federal government had grown, and much of it had to be funded through excise taxes, or taxes on the manufacturing of certain commodities, like alcohol. What's rather ironic is that McKinley actually changed his tune on tariffs in the end, delivering speeches on the need for trade liberalization and the replacement of tariffs with reciprocal trade agreements, aka how the world works now. Unfortunately, McKinley was shot just a day after giving a speech promoting this, and it wouldn't end up becoming reality for many years yet. But when Trump said, quote, in 1913, for reasons unknown to mankind, they established the income tax, end quote, he really should just say that he himself doesn't understand the reasons, because the reasons were plain. The need for varying forms of domestic taxation were clear, even to fellow tariff man William McKinley, and income tax had been levied before, first in 1861 to help pay for the Civil War, and then under McKinley's predecessor, Grover Cleveland, in an effort to reform the tariff that McKinley had passed while a congressman. The benefits of moving away from tariffs toward income taxation were clear even to McKinley by the end. An equitable income tax can not only bring in revenue but also mitigate inequality, and it does not impose the same risks of a tariff, of hampering international commerce, disrupting supply chains, and raising the price of goods. To put a fine point on it, income tax rescued the country from the failures of tariffs and protectionism. But tariffs wouldn't go away immediately. They were relied on again for additional revenue during World War I, and as you have probably heard recently, they were resorted to in the depths of the Depression as a potential savior, with disastrous results. In his defense of tariffs, Trump claimed that the time of glorious prosperity he had alluded to, when we were tariff-backed, quote, all came to a very abrupt end with the Great Depression, and it would have never happened if they had stayed with the tariff policy, end quote. The historical blindness in this statement is many levels deep. It ignores the many other factors, such as the stock market crash and banks failing, and instead suggests that it was the lack of tariffs that did it. The fact is that tariffs hadn't really gone anywhere and had actually been raised pretty recently in 1922 with the Fordney-McCumber tariff. And most absurd, it ignored the fact that during the Depression, tariffs were raised significantly in an effort to pull our economy out of its tailspin, leading to the collapse of international trade and worsening the global economic crisis. If you have been paying much attention at all to the discourse surrounding Trump's new tariff debacle, whether on cable television or on social media, you have likely seen the example of the Smoot-Hawley tariff raised. This is because it really is the most recent example of a major change in tariff policy, other than Trump's very own first-term tariff increases. It serves as an apt historical parallel as well, because it was a dramatic tariff increase that contributed to an economic collapse, and there is a handy little soundbite from the film Ferris Bueller's Day Off to illustrate this.
The Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act.
With the monotone teacher played by Ben Stein droning on, asking any of his students to take an interest. Anyone?
Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects?
As he explains that the tariffs, quote, did not work.
It did not work.
And the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression, end quote. This serves as a simple summary of the event, but it doesn't really give a sense of why it was done or how catastrophic it was. At the time, the stock market had already crashed, and the agricultural economy was on the ropes. Herbert Hoover had run for president on a promise of increasing tariffs on foreign produce and crops in order to help beleaguered domestic farmers. The eponymous Smoot and Hawley were the Republican senators who masterminded the legislation. The version of the tariff bill that was passed by both houses of Congress would be a total disaster, according to all the economists advising Hoover. And Hoover himself called it, quote-unquote, extortionate, recognizing that it was too punishing and would harm international relations. But Hoover signed it anyway, caving to pressure from Republicans. And what a shocker, expert economists were right. Immediate retaliatory tariffs by all our major trade partners absolutely halted international trade. Then came the Dust Bowl, and then came the failure of banks. Suffice it to say, the country was in dire peril, and Hoover was out, as was his whole party. Many of Hoover's supporters instead campaigned for FDR and his low tariff stance, and Democrats took both houses in 1932. Indeed, it is because of the abject failure of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that tariff power today sits more with the president than with Congress. It seemed as if such a dangerous power could not be entrusted to partisan representatives. So in 1934, Democrats passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which allowed FDR and future presidents to negotiate directly with trading partners for the purpose of reducing tariffs. This is something that Trump today misunderstands. Quote-unquote, reciprocal, he recently said of his tariffs. Quote, that means they do it to us, and we do it to them. Very simple. Can't get any simpler than that. End quote. it's clear that he views these tariffs as a threat or as a cudgel he can wield. But the term reciprocity, by definition, means an exchange for mutual benefit. The power of tariff negotiation was given to presidents not to start trade wars and alienate our international partners, but so that they could work toward multilateral trade agreements, the kind of liberalization of trade that William McKinley, in the end, realized we'd have to work toward. It was so we could avoid a repeat of Smoot-Hawley, when Congress made that very mistake. And it's very strange that Trump doesn't realize this, as we know he is sensitive to the idea of being another Herbert Hoover and presiding over the collapse of the American economy. In 2024, he was quoted as hoping the economy would collapse under Biden rather than during his second term. Quote, "because I don't want to be Herbert Hoover," end quote. The irony, however, is that he inherited a bull market from Biden and an economy that had strongly recovered from the COVID crisis despite inflation. And for the first time maybe in American history, because of his actions, the actions of one man, in doing exactly what had previously been done under Hoover, he single-handedly caused the stock market to crash. And in a sort of reverse Hoover, there is now some indication that Congress may move to reassert its own tariff authority. Just hours after Trump's Liberation Day announcement of exorbitant tariffs, a joint resolution passed the Senate to end the national emergency Trump declared and thereby, hopefully, block his universal tariffs. And this is in addition to two bills introduced in the House earlier this year in anticipation of Trump's further tariffs, the Prevent Tariff Abuse Act and the Congressional Trade Authority Act. It seems clear that since Trump has now proven that presidents, like Congress, can also not be trusted with unfettered tariff power, some new checks and balances are needed. But the big question, I think, is what was Trump thinking? There have been many, many theories regarding just exactly what Trump's intentions were with this extreme new round of tariffs. Many believed he had learned his lesson on tariffs in his first term. He may have mentioned tariffs in his 2024 campaign, something about them helping to bring auto manufacturing back to the U.S., or about how they would make up for the taxes on tips he promised to abolish. But mostly he was promising lower prices, and of course, higher tariffs would have the opposite effect in that regard. Some have suggested that these were never intended to be permanent or lasting, that they were only a negotiating tactic, a threat to force foreign nations to do his bidding. This does indeed sound like Trump, since he has been using all kinds of leverage to dominate any organization he feels needs to bend the knee to him, such as universities and law firms, and many sadly have caved to his bullying. Others think that the economic crisis he has kicked off is more of a feature than a bug, that he actually just intends to burn it to the ground. I have thought that this may be the case. His authoritarian and even fascist leanings are clear to me, as I've argued before. And so creating an emergency could be just what he needs to seize emergency powers and further undermine our democracy. He has certainly already weakened our status as a global superpower with these actions. But I'm often torn between viewing his actions as concerted efforts to destroy our democracy or just as corrupt schemes to make him money. And this too has been a widely proposed explanation of his tariffs. Trump has openly said, quote, "I do better in bad markets," end quote. And many have alleged evidence that his allies engaged in insider trading, knowing that the market would plummet with the precipitous tariff announcements and then surge with his announcement of their pause. In fact, Trump was caught on tape pointing to some of his billionaire investor supporters, Charles Schwab and Roger Penske, bragging about the obscene amount of money they made because he paused the tariffs. While this does make a lot of sense, I can't help but think that it just gives him far too much credit. There actually are indications that he really does believe in the efficacy of tariffs, that he really does think tariffs could replace income tax and somehow magically make factories reappear. And not modern roboticized factories, but the old Rust Belt factories of the late 19th and early to mid 20th century, which will likely never be operated here again. The reason this sort of manufacturing will never return to the US is that manufacturing never left the country. It has just evolved beyond the manufacturing of lower-end products and has embraced 3D printing, automation, and AI. Trump seems to be stuck in the 80s with his conception of manufacturing. The simple fact is that manufacturing goods is no longer as important to the US economy because we have come to rely more on the export of services. To focus so much on goods instead of services is completely outmoded thinking. We simply no longer have the raw materials, the infrastructure, or the expertise for a return to widespread domestic manufacturing on this scale, as in many cases, simply paying the exorbitant tariff would end up being less expensive than actually pivoting to domestic manufacturing. So the real hard truth of it is, this policy will hit small businesses that rely on a global supply chain the hardest. Even if it were feasible, even if these tariffs did result in a return to an economy predicated on domestic goods manufacturing, it would not happen for decades. Companies would only build these factories here if it really would cost them less in the long run, which means, again, they would have to be certain that the tariffs were permanent, since as soon as they were lifted, such factories would be undercut again by foreign manufacturers. But Trump has already exempted tech companies like Apple, the sort of company that could actually feasibly afford to open new factories, completely withdrawing any motivation to actually do so. And even if such a massive company were finally convinced that there was no other choice but to transition to domestic manufacturing, they would still likely rely on robotic arms and other automation. It wouldn't be the huge employment boon Trump imagines. And in the meanwhile, we would enter another devastating depression. But it really does seem like Trump imagines it could work, that he really does think he can use tariffs as Lincoln and McKinley did, that they can create jobs and do away with income tax. The problem is, he just doesn't know what he's doing. This fact is perfectly illustrated by the story of how he came to hire his tariff man, the chief advisor on his tariff policy, Peter Navarro. As the story goes, when Trump came into office the first time, he tasked his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, with finding a tariff policy expert who would agree with him. And Kushner proceeded to conduct this high-level search for a policy expert by browsing Amazon for books on tariffs. Apparently, one stood out, Navarro's book, Death by China, because of its bold title. Navarro has been criticized for fetishizing goods and ignoring the importance of services in the economy. And it appears it is from Navarro, who has been mocked by economists for not understanding the basic concept of the GDP, that Trump has taken his fundamental misunderstanding of trade deficits as being quote-unquote unfair. What is really absurd is that since Navarro's views are such outliers and so thoroughly refuted by experts, he resorted to appealing to an expert of his own, someone named Ron Vara, who supported all of Navarro's policies. However, it turned out that Ron Vara was not a real person. It was just a persona that Navarro had invented. His name actually an anagram of Navarro. So the more you look into it, the more it seems that Trump had some wrong ideas about tariffs, found an absolute crank of an economist to legitimize those views, and then became further convinced by the crank that they were right, despite what all the experts told him. The distinctly real possibility, then, is that at least sometimes Trump is not a scheming mafioso bent on destroying democracy and raising a fascist oligarchy. He is, but sometimes he can be earnest, and his intentions might be what he says they are. But he's just incompetent, ignorant of history, stubbornly overconfident, and easily led astray by quacks and con men who stroke his ego. And I don't know which is worse. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. You can find blog posts for each episode on historicalblindness.com that contain a transcript, related imagery, and citations for further reading. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons: Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Maddie Kinney, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Chris, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, an anonymous patron, Brian, CPJ MLT Ltd, and Jamie Nielsen. Thanks so much for your support. I know you patrons are concerned about our country, so again, I'll recommend 5calls.org to help you in your efforts to demand action from your representatives. Visit the website, which I'll link in the show notes, and you can find a page there called Demand Congress Stop Trump's Tariffs and Reclaim Trade Authority that will help you voice your concerns to Congress. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, as I tried to express in my recent episode on biblical literalism, one of the central problems with MAGA and the right in general is their scorn for expertise and education, something that appeals to their fundamentalist base. And this anti-intellectualism is what makes the movement a perfect tool for the anti-democratic forces arrayed against us. Keep learning, keep thinking critically, and keep resisting.
As a business owner, you're not chasing the norm, you're building momentum. But your bank wasn't made for modern money management. You need a Relay, an online money management platform that moves as fast as you do. With Relay, you can open up to 20 accounts so you can separate your cash for things like income, payroll, or operating expenses. All you need is a few minutes to sign up at relayfi.com/Spotify. That's relayfi.com/SPOTIFY. Relay is a financial technology company and is not a bank. Bank services provided by Thread Bank, member FDIC.
History isn't black and white, yet too often it's presented as such. Grey History, the French Revolution, is a long-form history podcast dedicated to exploring the ambiguities and nuances of the past. From a revolution of hope and liberty to the infamous Reign of Terror, you can't understand the modern world without understanding the French Revolution. So search for the French Revolution today.